May 31, 1942, 7 nautical miles beyond Sydney Heads, where the Pacific swells met the Australian coast in endless rhythm. 3 submarines rested beneath the surface, inside the steel belly of I-27. Sub-Lieutenant Kenshi Chuman adjusted his breathing apparatus one final time. The air tasted metallic, thick with the scent of diesel and human sweat, through the narrow confines of his Kokiki Mayit submarine. He could hear the pulse of the mother ship's engines, a mechanical heartbeat that would soon fade into memory above him, through 40 feet of black water. The last light of autumn filtered down in pale, ghostly columns in 4 hours. He and his crew would penetrate the harbor of Sydney, Australia's jewel. Its beating commercial heart. The briefing had been clear: minimal defenses, a sleeping giant. Ships lined up like toys in a bathtub, an easy kill, a message that would echo across the Pacific. He pulled the hatch shut, and the darkness swallowed everything but certainty. They were wrong. The certainty that carried those Japanese submariners into Sydney Harbor that night was built upon months of intelligence gathering, reconnaissance flights, and a fundamental miscalculation that would cost 6 men their lives and shatter the myth of Australian vulnerability. The attack on Sydney Harbor stands not merely as a footnote in the Pacific War, but as a turning point in the psychological and strategic defense of an entire continent. To understand what happened in those dark waters between May 31st and June 1st requires stepping back into the architecture of assumption that guided Japanese naval planning in the spring of 1942, and forward into the cold mathematics of what those assumptions meant when they collided with Australian resolve. By May 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had spent 5 months rewriting the rules of naval warfare. Pearl Harbor had demonstrated the power of surprise. The fall of Singapore had proven British invincibility was a lie. Written in fading ink: Hong Kong, Manila, the Dutch East Indies. Each conquest had come faster and easier than even Tokyo's most optimistic planners had dared imagine. The string of victories had created a dangerous psychology within the Japanese command structure, a belief that Allied defenses in the Pacific were uniformly weak, that shock and audacity could substitute for overwhelming force, and that morale victories carried strategic weight equal to territorial gains. The Imperial Navy's Submarine Command looked at Australia and saw not a nation on war footing, but a distant colonial outpost. Isolated and afraid, they were partially correct. Australia was afraid, but fear has a way of sharpening focus. The operation bore the designation Operation Kiskago, though history would remember it simply as the Sydney Harbor attack. The plan called for 5 fleet submarines: I-21, I-22, I-24, I-27, and I-29 to position themselves off the coast of New South Wales, each carrying a 2-man Ko Yoteki Miute submarine slung beneath its hull like a mechanical remora. These midgets were marvels of miniaturization, 46 feet long, displacing 19 tons. Armed with 2 torpedoes powerful enough to split a cruiser's keel, they had been used at Pearl Harbor with limited success. 5 deployed, all lost. Minimal damage inflicted, but the Japanese Navy had learned from that failure. Training had intensified. The crews selected for Sydney were among the finest. Volunteers who had spent months practicing night navigation, torpedo calculations, and the art of dying gloriously should escape prove impossible. The intelligence picture painted for these men was both detailed and fatally incomplete. Warrant Flying Officer Nobuo Fujita had flown reconnaissance missions over Sydney on February 17th and again on May 23rd. Launching from submarine I-29 in a Yokosuka E-14Y floatplane, his reports described capital ships at anchor, merchant vessels crowding the wharves, and defensive measures that appeared cursory at best. He noted the presence of anti-submarine indicator loops strung Across the harbor entrance, electromagnetic cables designed to detect metallic hulls passing overhead, but also observed that civilian ferry traffic crossed these loops with such frequency that distinguishing a submarine from a passenger vessel would be nearly impossible. He photographed the incomplete anti-submarine boom net, a barrier of steel mesh and buoys stretching between George's Head and Lang Point. The net was unfinished. Gaps yawned 400 meters wide on either side of the completed central section, passages large enough to sail a cruiser through, let alone a WWII submarine barely wider than a large automobile. What Fujita's reconnaissance could not capture, what no aerial photograph could reveal, was the state of mind behind those defenses. Sydney in May 1942 was a city transformed by war. Darwin had been bombed 3 months earlier, on February 19th. In an attack larger than Pearl Harbor, 188 Japanese aircraft had killed 235 people and sunk 9 ships. The psychological impact had been immense. If Darwin could be struck with such force, what was to prevent Sydney from receiving the same treatment? The attack on the Soviet merchant vessel Welland on May 16th, torpedoed 30 miles off Newcastle by I-29, had brought the war even closer. Shipping between Sydney and Newcastle was halted for 24 hours while destroyers and aircraft hunted unsuccessfully for the submarine. The Royal Australian Navy knew the Japanese were operating in Australian waters. They simply did not know where, or in what strength, or with what objective. The man responsible for Sydney Harbour's defense was Rear Admiral Gerard Muirhead Gould, a Royal Navy officer whose career had been built on traditions of naval warfare that were rapidly becoming obsolete. Muirhead Gould believed in visible deterrence, ships at anchor showing the flag, regular patrols, and the assumption that no rational commander would risk valuable assets in a heavily defended harbor. The problem was that Sydney Harbour's defenses existed more on paper than in reality. Of the 8 anti-submarine indicator loops strung around the harbor entrance, 6 were inactive on the night of May 31st, 2 due to equipment failure, 4 because there were insufficient trained personnel to monitor them. The loop between North Head and South Head had been giving false readings since 1940 and was routinely ignored. The boom net remained incomplete due to material shortages. Defensive flotilla consisted of converted pleasure launches, armed with depth charges, auxiliary minesweepers, and patrol boats whose top speed barely exceeded 15 knots. What the Japanese submarines carried into battle was not just torpedoes and fuel, but expectation. The crews of the WWII submarines had been told to expect light resistance, confused defenders, and the chaos that comes when an enemy is caught unprepared. They expected to navigate through the harbor defenses like ghosts, to line up their torpedoes on the anchored cruisers and destroyers with the methodical precision of men shooting fish in a barrel. They expected, above all, that Sydney would react as Singapore had reacted, as Manila had reacted, with shock giving way to paralysis, giving way to surrender. The Australian character, forged in isolation and tempered by a history of making do with less, was something the intelligence reports had failed to adequately capture. At 17:20 hours on May 31st, the first WWII submarine launched from I-27 heavy seas delayed its approach. Waves 8 feet high battering the tiny craft as Sub-Lieutenant Schumann fought to maintain course towards Sydney Heads. The plan called for 3 submarines to enter at 20-minute intervals, passing through the harbor defenses just after nightfall when visibility would be poor, but navigation still possible by visual reference. M14 Schumann's boat crossed the Middle Head to South Head indicator loop at 20:01 hours. The loop registered the magnetic signature. The operator on duty noted the reading, hesitated, and dismissed it as another ferry. Civilian traffic had been crossing that loop all evening. The alarm was not raised for 29 minutes. M14 proceeded unmolested through the outer harbor, navigating by periscope and compass toward the anti-submarine boom net. The net's incomplete state was immediately apparent. The western gap yawning wide enough for Schumann to pass through without even submerging. But in the darkness, with visibility reduced to mere yards, the submarine's commander misjudged his approach angle at 2015. M14 struck the pile light in navigation, marker mounted on the net's edge with enough force to jolt both crewmen against their seats. Schumann threw the electric motors into reverse. But the propeller fouled in the net's steel mesh. The submarine's stern was trapped. The bow breaking the surface at a 40-degree angle. A Maritime Services Board watchman named Jim Cargill saw the bow emerge in the pale moonlight. The submarine's hull gleamed like the back of some surfacing whale. Cargill stared for several seconds, his mind struggling to reconcile what his eyes reported with what logic suggested should not be possible. Then he climbed into his rowboat and approached the object close enough to touch the hull. He confirmed what could not be denied: a foreign submarine trapped in Sydney's defensive net. Its crew undoubtedly aware that discovery was now inevitable. Cargill rowed immediately to the patrol boat HMAS Roma to report his finding. Message that followed should have triggered an immediate harbor-wide alert. Instead, it entered the communication chain at 2015 and did not reach Sydney Naval Headquarters until 21:52, over 90 minutes later. The reasons for this delay have been debated by historians for decades, but the practical effect was to gift the remaining 2 Japanese submarines an additional hour of operational freedom. When patrol boats Euroma and Lolita finally converged on the trapped submarine, they found MEM-14's crew had made a choice rather than face capture. Sub-Lieutenant Schumann and his crewmen detonated one of their submarine's scuttling charges at 22:35 hours. The explosion tore through the submarine's forward section, killing both men instantly and sending a column of water and debris 50 feet into the air. The boom of the explosion echoed off the sandstone cliffs of Middle Head. A sound heard across half of Sydney War had come not to some distant jungle or desert, but here, to the harbor where families picnicked on weekends and ferries carried office workers home from the city. Muirhead Gould issued the general alarm at 22:27 hours, repeated at 22:36 with orders for all ships to take anti-submarine precautions. The response across Sydney Harbor was immediate and chaotic. Searchlights stabbed into the darkness from a dozen points, their beams crisscrossing the water like the fingers of blind giants groping for invisible prey. Ships' companies raced to action stations. Depth charges were armed machine guns swiveled on their mounts, gunners scanning black water for targets that refused to materialize. And into this heightened state of alert, the second MEAD submarine entered undetected. M-24 crossed the indicator loop at 21:48 hours and followed a Manly ferry through the gap in the boom net at approximately 2200 hours. The pilot identity unknown. Body never recovered demonstrated seamanship that bordered on the supernatural. The gap in the net measured only 91 meters wide. The ferry's hull displaced 3,000 tons, its wake churning white in the darkness, to follow that close behind. To time the approach so precisely that the ferry's magnetic signature masked the submarine's own required nerves of steel and reflexes honed by endless training. For 22 minutes, M-24 moved through Sydney Harbor undetected, its commander scanning for the primary target. The heavy cruiser USS Chicago sat at anchor off Garden Island, her bulk illuminated by floodlights from the new Captain Cook graving dock under construction nearby. The cruiser represented the most valuable target in the harbor. 8,000 tons, 9 8-inch guns, veteran of multiple engagements in the Pacific Campaign. Sinking her would be a propaganda coup and a genuine blow to Allied naval strength in the region. At 22:52 hours, a searchlight operator aboard Chicago spotted M-24 less than 500 meters to starboard. The submarine was running on the surface, its conning tower cutting a white wake through the black water. The operator shouted the alarm. Chicago's 5-inch guns opened fire immediately, the muzzle blasts shattering the night. Shells screaming across the water, but the guns could not depress low enough. Most rounds passed over the submarine entirely. Some skipped across the water like flat stones, striking Fort Denison's Martello Tower and sending fragments into the suburbs of Cremona and Mosman. Civilians blocks away threw themselves to the floor as shell splinters tore through walls and gardens. The submarine dove in the chaos of searchlights and gunfire. It vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. For 20 minutes it remained submerged, its commander listening to the hydrophone's amplified symphony, destroyer propellers chopping water, depth charges detonating in the distance, the ping of active sonar searching. Then, with a calculation that spoke to extraordinary courage or extraordinary fatalism, the commander brought M24 back to periscope depth southwest of Bradley's Head. From this position, he could see Chicago's stern silhouetted against the construction lights. He fired both torpedoes. The first torpedo ran true for 200 meters, then struck the harbor bed beneath the Dutch submarine KX and failed to detonate. The second torpedo passed under KX, clearing its keel by less than 1 meter and continued toward Chicago for 3 seconds. The war hung in balance. If that torpedo struck home, if Chicago's magazines detonated, the explosion would kill hundreds and hand Japan a victory that would reverberate through every Allied command structure in the Pacific. The torpedo's gyroscope was set fractionally off angle, perhaps knocked askew by the shock of launching, perhaps miscalibrated before departure. It missed Chicago by 4 meters and continued across the harbor until it struck the converted ferry. HMAS Cuttable was moored alongside Garden Island, serving as a temporary barracks for sailors awaiting ship assignments. At the moment of impact, 19 Australian and 2 British sailors were asleep in hammocks slung below decks. The torpedo struck amidships, its warhead containing 350 kilograms of high explosive. The detonation lifted Cuttable bodily out of the water, breaking her keel in 3 places. Fire erupted from the ruptured fuel tanks. Men below decks never woke. Those on deck were hurled into the water, some unconscious, some already dead from blast trauma, some screaming for help that came too late. The ferry sank in less than 4 minutes, settling onto the harbor bottom in a cloud of air bubbles and burning oil. 21 men died in that explosion. Their names deserve recording: Able Seaman Edward Roy Birrell, Able Seaman Alfred Frederick Brand, Able Seaman Leslie James Carr, Able Seaman Norman Hartley Clark, Able Seaman Ernest Alfred Collins, Able Seaman Thomas Frederick Curlewis, Able Seaman Thomas Edward Griffin, Able Seaman Douglas Bickford Hughes, Able Seaman Charles John Johnston, Able Seaman Alec Morris Martin, Able Seaman James Cook Peacock, Able Seaman Alexander Douglas Ralston, Able Seaman Victor Charles Simpson, Able Seaman Ronald Arthur Taylor, Able Seaman Sidney Walter Williams, Ordinary Seaman Frederick William Isaac, Stoker Robert James Davidge, Stoker Jack Kenneth Hinmarsh, Stoker Walter James Smith, Leading Supply Assistant Leslie Herbert Collins, and Royal Navy Petty Officer Richard Wade. They were not soldiers caught in the fury of a jungle firefight. They were sailors sleeping in what should have been a safe harbor, killed by a war that had suddenly reached across thousands of miles of ocean to find them. The third mute submarine M21 entered Sydney Harbor last and survived longest. It crossed the indicator loop undetected and navigated through the Western Gap and the boom net. Shortly after M24, unlike its sister craft, M21 did not immediately press the attack. Its commander, Sub-Lieutenant Katsuhisa Ban, spent over an hour reconnoitering, mapping the positions of major vessels, calculating firing solutions. This methodical approach nearly succeeded. Shortly after midnight on June 1st, depth charges from patrol vessels Steady Hour and Yaroma began detonating in Min 21's vicinity. The submarine attempted to flee toward the harbor mouth, but the patrol vessels had triangulated its position through multiple sonar contacts at 050 hours. A pattern of 6 depth charges bracketed the submarine. The explosions crushed the pressure hull like a tin can. 21 sank in 30 feet of water off Taylor's Bay, killing both crewmen instantly. The bodies were recovered 3 days later when the Royal Australian Navy raised the submarine's sub-lieutenant. Ban and his crewmen were found still at their stations, faces composed, hands still gripping controls. A silk banner was found in the hull, inscribed with the words, "All of us are determined to die to achieve our aim." That banner would become a point of controversy in the days that followed, for Rear Admiral Muirhead Gould made a decision that shocked many Australians. He ordered that the 4 recovered Japanese submariners be cremated with full military honors on June 9th. The ceremony took place at the Eastern Suburbs Crematorium. A firing party of Australian sailors presented arms. 3 volleys cracked. Across the cemetery, a bugler played the last post the same somber notes that farewelled Australian dead from Gallipoli to Greece. Muirhead Gould stood at attention throughout, his face showing no emotion. The decision was criticized in Parliament and in newspapers across the country. How could Australia honor men who had just killed 21 sailors in their sleep? But Muirhead Gould's reasoning was simple and, in its way, profound. These men were brave. They carried out their duty as they saw it. We accord them the respect that brave men deserve, regardless of which flag they served. The ashes were returned to Japan after the war in 1968. One of the attack's masterminds, former submarine commander Hankyu Sasaki, returned to Sydney for a reunion with Australian veterans. He laid a wreath at the cuttable memorial. Photographs from that day show elderly men on both sides, gray-haired and bent with age, standing together in a silence that spoke louder than any speech. The bay that had run red with blood 26 years earlier reflected only sky, but in June 1942, reconciliation was unthinkable. What followed the harbor attack was not calm reflection, but cold fury. The psychological impact on Australian civilians was immense. If Japanese submarines could penetrate Sydney Harbor, the nation's largest and most important port then, nowhere was safe. Panic buying emptied grocery stores. Families in coastal suburbs began packing essential belongings, preparing for evacuation orders that never came. The government introduced new regulations almost daily, expanded blackout zones, curfews for enemy aliens, restrictions on travel. Fear metastasized to the population like a cancer, fed by rumors that multiplied faster than official denials could counter them. Japanese invasion fleets were spotted off Brisbane. Imaginary paratroopers were landing in the Blue Mountains. Fiction. But the fear was real, and it drove real policy. The military response was systematic and overwhelming. Convoy operations were established immediately to protect merchant shipping along the eastern coast. The incomplete anti-submarine boom net was finished by August, its steel mesh now spanning the entire width of the harbor without gaps. Additional indicator loops were installed and personnel trained to operate them around the clock. Patrol vessel strength was tripled. Every approach to Sydney Harbor received attention from engineers and planners who understood that luck had played as large a role as skill in preventing a greater catastrophe. Had the torpedo struck Chicago instead of Cuttable, had the Meade submarines coordinated their attacks instead of operating independently, had Japanese intelligence been more accurate about Allied ship movements, the outcome could have been catastrophically different. The failed attack also triggered a fundamental reassessment of Australian strategic vulnerability. The country had spent the first 2 years of World War II sending its best troops to fight in North Africa and Greece, operating on the assumption that distance from Japan provided inherent security. The fall of Singapore in February had shaken that Assumption: the bombing of Darwin had cracked. The Sydney Harbour attack shattered it completely within weeks. Divisions were being recalled from the Middle East industrial production, shifted from agricultural exports to military manufacturing. American troops began arriving in numbers that would eventually exceed 1 million, an occupying force in all but name. Though welcomed rather than resisted, Australia transformed from a complacent Commonwealth nation into a militarized society with enemies at the gate for the Japanese submariners who survived the cruise of the 5 fleet submarines that waited offshore while the Meade submarines made their attacks. The operation was judged a failure. Captain Hankyu Sasaki filed a report acknowledging that Australian defenses had been stronger than anticipated, that coordination between the Meade submarines had broken down, and that tactical objectives had not been achieved. Of the 3 primary targets, USS Chicago, HMAS Canberra, and any battleships present, none had been damaged. The only ship sunk was a converted ferry with no combat value. 6 trained submariners had been lost. Along with 3 irreplaceable Meade submarines, the intelligence estimate had been wrong. The defenders had been more alert, more capable, and more resilient than predicted, but the intelligence failure ran deeper than mere military miscalculation. What the Japanese command had fundamentally misunderstood was the nature of Australian society under pressure. The reconnaissance photographs showed incomplete defenses and minimal patrol activity. They did not show the welders working double shifts to complete the boom net. They did not show the volunteers training on anti-submarine procedures. They did not show the grimly determined civilians who, having heard about Singapore and Darwin, had decided that Sydney would not fall without a fight. The Japanese High Command looked at Australia and saw a colonial backwater, far from the centers of power, defended by second-rate forces with obsolete equipment. They failed to see that distance from power also meant distance from the illusions that attended power, the belief that someone else would handle the crisis, that the adults were in charge, that safety was something provided rather than something earned. The symbolic object that threads through this story, the element that recurs in every testimony and every historical account, is the torpedo, not as a weapon in the abstract, but as a physical presence. 6 feet long, painted black, weighing half a ton, packed with enough explosive to vaporize steel and boil water. 4 torpedoes were fired into Sydney Harbour that night. 2 failed to detonate. 1 struck the wrong target. 1 was later recovered from the harbor floor, its warhead still armed, its propeller still sharp enough to draw blood. The torpedo that sank Cuttable was never recovered. It detonated with such force that fragments were scattered across hundreds of square meters of harbor bottom. But the psychological weight of those torpedoes, the knowledge that they had been fired, that more could be fired at any time, that the ocean which surrounded and defined Australia could also deliver death from invisible hands, that weight pressed on the national consciousness for years afterward. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, the 5 Japanese fleet submarines that had transported the midgets embarked on a campaign of commerce raiding along the Australian coast. Over the next week, they attacked 7 merchant vessels, sinking 3 and killing 50 sailors. On the night of June 8th, I-24 and I-21 surfaced and bombarded Sydney and Newcastle with their deck guns, a gesture more theatrical than militarily significant, but one that reinforced the message that Australian waters were not safe. The shells that struck Sydney landed in the eastern suburbs, damaging houses and gardens but causing no casualties. Residents who had dismissed the earlier submarine attack as a one-time fluke now understood. The war was not something that happened elsewhere. It was here. It was ongoing, and it required a response commensurate with the threat. That response came not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation Of 1,000 small changes, anti-aircraft batteries proliferated. Along the coast, rationing became stricter. Industrial production targets were revised upward. The political leadership, which had spent months reassuring the public that invasion was unlikely, now spoke in grimmer tones about sacrifice and vigilance. The American alliance, which had existed primarily on paper since Pearl Harbor, became operational with the arrival of General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Melbourne and the steady flow of troops and equipment that followed. Australia ceased to think of itself as Britain's junior partner in an imperial enterprise and began to understand itself as the southern anchor of a Pacific defense perimeter that would hold or break based on Australian will. The crews of the Mayit submarines had expected to find weakness. What they found instead was a nation discovering its strength. Through necessity, the defenses they encountered were improvised, incomplete, and often ineffective, the indicator loops that failed to sound alarms, the boom net with gaps wide enough to sail through, the patrol boats armed with weapons from the previous war. But behind those inadequate defenses stood men and women who refused to yield. The Maritime Services Board watchman who rowed his boat toward a foreign submarine to confirm what it was, the searchlight operator on Chicago who spotted a target. Most men would have missed the patrol boat, crews who hunted submarines through the dark with nothing but sonar and intuition, the civilian population that absorbed the shock of attack and, instead of breaking, hardened. These were not the actions of a weak people. These were the actions of a people who had looked into the abyss and found their reflection staring back. The Japanese submarines withdrew from Australian waters in mid-June, their mission incomplete, their losses unacceptable relative to the damage inflicted. They carried with them lessons that would be analyzed and debated in Tokyo for months, lessons about Allied defensive capabilities, about the limits of surprise attacks, about the dangers of underestimating an enemy based on geography alone. But they also carried something less tangible, a recognition that the easy victories of December and January were behind them, that every mile further from Japan would be bought at increasing cost, that the war they had imagined would be short and decisive was instead revealing itself to be long and brutal and balanced on edges, so fine that luck and human error determined outcomes as often as strategy. For Australia, the attack on Sydney Harbour became a defining moment in the national mythology. The night when war stopped being an abstraction, reported in newspapers, and became a lived reality, experienced by civilians in their own homes. Schools teach it today as part of the standard curriculum. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra displays one of the recovered Mayit submarines, its hull patched but otherwise intact, a physical reminder of vulnerability. Overcome memorials stand at Cuttable, where the ferry sank, at Taylor's Bay, where N21 was destroyed, at the eastern suburbs crematorium, where former enemies were honored as warriors. These memorials serve not to glorify war, but to mark transformation, the moment when a nation stopped assuming safety and started building it. The epilogue to the story unfolds across decades. In 1980, a group of Australian veterans traveled to Japan and met with surviving members of the submarine fleet that had carried out the attack. They drank sake together. They exchanged photographs of themselves as young men, impossibly young, wearing uniforms and carrying certainties that time had stripped away. They talked about the night of May 31st with the kind of precision that only participants in extraordinary events can summon. The exact angle of a searchlight beam, the sound of a depth charge detonating through a steel hull, the taste of fear mixed with adrenaline, mixed with duty, and they agreed. Across the gulf of language and history and irreconcilable memories, that the men who had died that night, Australian and Japanese alike, had died doing their duty as they understood it. in service to causes they believed were just. This is what remains when the smoke clears and the water stills, not victory or defeat, but recognition. The Japanese submariners, who entered Sydney Harbor carrying assumptions of easy conquest, found instead a truth that military planners often learn too late, that defenders fighting for their homeland possess advantages that cannot be measured by counting ships or calculating firepower. Australians who stood watch that night, who hunted submarines through the dark, who pulled survivors from burning water and buried the dead with honors, learned a complementary truth: that distance is no defense, that safety is not given but taken, that the price of survival is vigilance paid in the currency of sacrifice. The bay ran red that night, but dawn came, as dawn always does, revealing water cleansed by tide and time. What remained in the memory was not the color of blood, but the knowledge of what it had cost. 21 Australian sailors died in their sleep, killed by men who never knew their names. 6 Japanese submariners died pursuing orders issued by commanders who would survive the war. Both groups paid for decisions made by others, fighting a war they did not start, dying for reasons that history would judge ambiguous at best. But their deaths forced recognition that the Pacific War would not be won by surprise attacks on sleeping targets, that Australia would not yield without exacting a terrible price, and that every assumption of easy victory would be tested against the hard reality of enemies who refused to behave as expected in the end. The Japanese did not underestimate Australia's defenses, they underestimated Australia itself, the capacity of a democratic society to mobilize when threatened, the resilience of a population that had built a nation on the world's harshest continent, the stubborn refusal to accept defeat that comes from having nowhere else to retreat to. The defenses that night were inadequate, the men and women behind them were not, and in that gap between material readiness and moral resolve, the course of a war was altered, not decisively, not dramatically, but enough, just enough, which, when survival is measured in margins, is all that history requires. The torpedoes lie still now, those that did not detonate rusting slowly in harbor mud, artifacts waiting for archaeologists, who will analyze them as curiosities from a vanished conflict. But the truth they carried, that war spares no one, that courage manifests in unexpected places, and that underestimating an enemy because they lack weapons is to misunderstand what makes an enemy dangerous. That truth endures. Sydney Harbor remains one of the world's great ports, crowded with commerce and innocent of the scars that once marked its waters. Only memory remains, and memory, properly tended, is the strongest defense of all.